interesting is, how interesting it is. I am the opening presentation on behalf of all the 9 operators who are involved. First of all, I'm going to speak to the English speakers. The live interpretation is available on this Zoom platform. And for French, you can also activate English into French or French into English. You can use the language you wish as you are speaking. So click on the interpretation button and on the French button if you wish to listen in French. So that's it for the technical recommendations. Before we start this morning, I should tell you that there are 9 co-organizers involved in this presentation. Acadie, Fing, and the Institut Plus, Sping Consulting, Shares and Workers Network, Startin'blox, the emerging technology products. This is run by the Moral and Economic Activities Sciences. So that's it for the major partners. So before I hand over to our speakers, I would just like to say that the idea behind this event, dedicated to interoperability, dates from about 2 years ago, before the COVID crisis, and so an eternity ago. Back then, this is a year after the implementation of GDPR. So the Solid community was responsible for bringing this issue to center stage, notably Tim Berners-Lee. With Inria, there were a few initiatives by others, but the question was pretty badly understood, or at least poorly understood, and particularly at the industrial level. Our initial ambition 2 years ago was to organize a major conference to raise awareness, to make things more understandable around the interoperability of platforms. So that was supposed to take place in the summer of 2020, and then the health crisis struck. So it's pretty easy to say this, and this is a crisis which has made a brutal acceleration possible across all sectors with regard to digital, but it's a crisis in Cap Digital. We see this as a fairly powerful revealer of fragility and of the inequalities in our digital models, notably with regard to terminals, but also with regard to digital services. Fragility is sometimes linked to our capacity to link to a network, fragilities with regard to digital literacy, our capacity per se to use digital tools, but also fragility linked to our high level of dependency on the major platforms, whose use has really gone through the roof during the crisis. And then the impact of this economy on our society, on our social interactions, but also on the activities of our businesses and our capacity to innovate. There are lots of subjects involved here on the way that we're designing our territories, the real space of our territories. And so we understand now much better how this series of impacts is developing. And so we are going to offer you a series of meetings in order to get a better understanding of how the alternatives are emerging currently, in order to propose a different type of web, which is less organized around the major platforms. We're going to ask about new norms, technologies which are emerging. With regard to interoperability, we're going to try and understand how businesses can use these technologies in order to improve and reinforce market access, how the new norms can help Europe to reconquer its own digital sovereignty in order to create a context for more fair competition, particularly with regard to the Americas, and see how the organization of our businesses and institutions will be affected. And so we're going to try and answer today and in future events, which will be offered more in the style of thematic workshops organized around different, more specific industries. What we're going to try and do today is tackle this question of interoperability. We're going to deal with that throughout this morning until midday through the major transverse orientations, the interoperability of platforms. We're going to see how it can be asserted as a way of reconnecting to the original idea behind the web as it was imagined initially. And we'll have a presentation by Olivier Branger, who's the head of the unit at the European Commission in charge of the next generation internet, and Gilles Babinet, who's co-chairman at the French Digital National Council and digital champion of the European Commission. Thank you to both of you for being here with us today. And then after this initial preamble, we'll open a roundtable called Interoperability as a means for rebuilding the web with Jean-François Abramatic. He's Emeritus Director at Inria, Alain Assouline, the CINOV, and Gilles Babinet, who will still be with us, Antoine Garnier of the IDSA, and it will be moderated by Odile Chagny. She's from the Sharers and Workers Network. Who've contributed a very great deal to the preparation of this conference, and Michiel Jong, who's from Ponder Source and who is also an expert on the DAPSI project. I'm going to talk about that right now. Then we'll be focusing on that this afternoon with the DAPSI final event, which will last all afternoon from 1:30 through till 4:45. We'll look at the more concrete and technical aspects, discovering the 7 prize-winning project of this DAPSI program. DAPSI program is a European project financed by the European Commission through the Next Generation Internet Initiative, and which is dedicated to the portability of data. So there'll be a pitch from the 7 prize-winning projects from this DAPSI program, which was incubated and supported for a year by European experts who are developing their innovation. And once we have listened to the pitches from the 7 projects, we'll have 2 round tables. The first with we're talking about the improving the portability of data, and that will be chaired by Michiel de Jong, and then there'll be a second roundtable with all the project leaders for the DAPSI program around tech transfer and scaling up, and that will be moderated by Bertrand Lejeune from Cap Digital. That's it for the program. So and now I can tell you that you can interact with our speakers and our presenters. We're going to keep a few slots for the questions which you want to ask the speakers. So I would ask you to pose your question directly via chat. So think about the questions you want to ask, send them to us by chat, and then we will ask our presenters in the Q&A sessions. You can also, if you wish, raise your hand during the Q&A sessions, and we can give you the floor via webcam. Throughout the morning, there will be a whole series of polls asking what's your level of understanding. of the issues we're going to be dealing with. There'll be 5 different multiple choice questions, and we'd invite you to answer them. This meeting will be recorded and made available in a few days' time, and a report on the meeting will be made available and will be sent to you. I see in the chat some people are already beginning to introduce themselves. Don't hesitate to allow us all to meet each other virtually, of course, but let's try and make this as dynamic as possible using the networking dimension, which is the added value of this type of conference. I'm going to hand over to Olivier Branger, who's at the Next Generation Internet Initiative at the European Commission. Olivier, over to you. Hello, thank you, Antoine. Hello, everyone. So my name is Olivier Branger. I'm in charge of this Next Generation Internet Initiative, but also around the Internet Governance Project within the Commission. I'm very happy to open this event. I find it's been organized in a very interesting way, with, as Antoine has just explained, a more general discussion can be taken in order to promote that. And this morning and then this afternoon, a presentation and a demo of a certain number of projects in the DAPSI and the NGI initiative around the ways that internet innovators are implementing interoperability and the portability of data, of services. And so the day's proceedings are going to be very interesting. So what I'm going to do in my introduction is to open these 2 different aspects, the more general aspect of the, and say a few words about our way of tackling this question in the NGI initiative. I'm going to start by saying, and you already said this, Antoine, interoperability is really at the heart of internet. It's one of the drivers of the internet. It's linked to the historic architecture of the internet. It's a decentralized architecture based on protocols which are open and increasingly on free software, which are at the heart of internet. And we'll find this in standardization of internet, which are open mechanisms which took place in the IUTF or WCCC, W3C. So this made the network aspect of internet possible. As in terms of technology, it's a function of the number of users that already use it. So this has been verified for the internet network and also for a certain number of services on which it is based. For example, the domain names service, the DNS, we use them every day. We forget that they're perfectly interoperable, like email or the web itself, but also applications that operate on that model. And so it's interesting to note that currently we're numerous to be able to access internet through certain platforms which extensively exploit this infrastructure, but the platforms are centralized. They used proprietary technologies and often exploit or monetize the data of their users. And contrary to the internet philosophy, these platforms are centralized and often non-interoperable. For example, it's not possible today to send a message from one instant messaging service to another. It's not possible to comment from a platform, comment a post published on a different platform. It's not possible to access a platform through an identification service of a different platform. So from our point of view, this poses certain problems, notably market access for new stakeholders. And so innovation could intervene here. There's also a problem with regard to consumers who are captured to a certain extent by certain suppliers, and they can encounter difficulties in moving from one platform to another platform. And so it's not surprising that the European legislator has tackled this question. First of all, with regard to data protection, personal protection data with GDPR, and which allows our users to move from one service to another with their data. And beyond the questions of law, there are also questions of implementation, which are complex, the format of personal data, which involve the semantics of those data. And as I already noted, that DAPSI program has devoted a lot of its resources to those questions, and I will get back to that. Currently, there's a debate which everyone is interested in, and that's around the regulation of the major stakeholders in the market, the gatekeepers, as we call them, around the proposition of the European Commission regarding a law for the Digital Markets Act, the DMA. So without going into the details of this proposal, which is very complete and quite complex, and which is currently under negotiation with European co-legislators, that's the European Parliament and the member states, I would say the objective in general is to establish a legislative framework to allow a larger contestability of markets, and so to enhance consumer choice. The legal text and certain obligations with regard to interoperability are at the key of the matter, notably interoperability between the involved platforms and third-party services like payments, identification, or advertising. There are also obligations in terms of interoperability of data in order to promote portability of data and to allow users on the basis of the rights that have been acquired in GDPR to go from one platform to another. Sorry, the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, is aiming at certain stakeholders in particular. So there's no horizontal application for all market stakeholders. It's under the biggest stakeholders who control access to certain markets, because we think at the Commission that that's where the problem really exists. If we impose certain interoperability conditions to these stakeholders, that will have a major effect on the markets, but and a dimensioned, sized consequence. At the Commission level, we see that interoperability is an instrument for achieving a unified digital market to allow, promote its fluidity. I've talked about two instruments we are using, the GDPR and the DMA, but there are other instruments which are being used in order to enhance interoperability. One instrument is the policy of competitivity. It's a specific instrument and involves certain dominant stakeholders who are abusing their dominant position, and which can lead to limited access to certain infrastructures. So there's a European legislation aiming at standardization, promoting uniformity of standards across Europe. These standards are open, which allow for interoperability, and they are linked to this is an important question in this is how can we reinforce the role of European institutions in forums of standardization. Another field, which not necessarily is it's important for our commissioner in particular, that's the domain of data. So this is what we're explaining in our strategy around data. We're trying to create a European data space. So this data space, the idea is to promote the free circulation of data, in particular industrial data, and their reusability and their reuse. And to that end, we have suggested a certain number of non-legislative measures, but also legislative measures like the recent proposal around the data regulation, and also a proposal around a data act, which will be forthcoming later this year. This is a domain which is very important too, around interoperability and the portability of data in order to have a European data space, and notably with regard to industrial data. And then there are all the aspects which are more vertical. We're talking about the horizontal aspects. We're working notably with the different sectors in order to develop norms, best practice rules, and to promote interoperability, migration from one supplier to another supplier, and so forth. And so there are a certain number of pieces of work underway regarding notably cloud commuting, internet. Those are instruments which are pretty general, which we're looking at in the Commission with the interested parties. We also think it's important, in parallel with this instrument, in parallel with the regulations, to develop the technologies to allow portability and interoperability. And this is what we're trying to initiate with the NGI initiative, which is working to translate technology and code, values and the principles, which are Europe's. So protection of private data and openness. These are centered on human beings. They give users the control of their own data, and to give them as much autonomy as possible with regard to their suppliers and in general in their interaction with the digital world. This initiative, as I was saying, seeks to implement the openness. So we support systems which are interoperable and which can dialogue amongst themselves, web original, where email services will continue to work together. So to have technologies which are interoperable and which can dialogue between themselves. And then also with regard to norms, we're supporting our innovators in their search to develop norms. So we have developers who work in W3C and elsewhere, and we're trying to base NGI technologies in existing standards. One example I can give here is the Activity Hub. This is a standard, a norm developed by W3C for decentralized web services. Certain number of our innovators are contributing. Antoine mentioned Solid, which is also a W3C standard norm. And we also have innovators who are contributing to standards and also to implementation. So the NGI initiative is very bottom up. We work directly on what innovators are doing. We support the free software development. These are innovators who come from university, research, startups, small innovative companies. And we invite them to work on fairly cutting edge technologies and that are aiming very concretely at the internet in particular. We're investing heavily in trust technology and protection of privacy. And they were very useful within the context of the health crisis, offering communication solutions for cooperation available on the market, for example, by offering alternatives in terms of instant messaging. So this is an opportunity for me to say a few words about the DAPSI program. DAPSI is one of the NGI initiatives which brings together a consortium of 6 partners, including Cap Digital, who is a co-organizer of today's event. And as I was saying, DAPSI, as the other NGIs, provides direct support to innovators. 80% of the budget of this project is aimed at innovators, asking them to develop concrete solutions around questions of portability in the broadest sense. It's interesting. And I'm delighted that you're going to allow innovators to come and show their solutions. There are 7 projects which will be resulting from the first call for tender within DAPSI, and they'll be presenting their results, and we'll see how they are tackling the questions of portability and protocols and data. So I would invite all participants to discover these concrete solutions, which are really very complex. So that's it for my general introduction. This is a panorama of the different solutions which are being developed by the Commission in order to promote interoperability, and notably via internet. I think that interoperability is, so once interoperability is placed, users have the control of his or her own data to the choice of a supplier. And so this is really a question that is central for us within the NGI initiative. 2 points which I haven't tackled yet, but we will be talking about them with the panel. And we'll talk about that during the 2 workshops this afternoon. The first question is the question of information and re-education of users. So we can have the legal situation, the technologies on site, and the technologies which have been developed, but we have to inform users and train them and let them know how they can use and to exploit their rights to the use of this technology. And so we go from a service from one platform to another. So there's a lot of work to be done on that. And I think it would be good to see the best way of achieving that. The other point that could be interesting to evoke would be to see how in Europe we can tackle this at European level. So we have to look at this with the whole community in European institutions, the Commission, the member states, industry, representatives of civil society, in order to weigh on questions of interoperability at world level. And we can see that currently, in general, in the domain of internet, of digital in general, the questions which can seem a little around interoperability standards, they were classified as being technical, but they're becoming ever more political. And there's sometimes high levels of antagonism around these. We've seen that on the subject of standardization of internet, for example, last year. There was fairly heated debate around this subject. And if Europe wants to weigh on this question, we need to be extremely well coordinated. And so that is perhaps a subject which can be tackled over the course of the day. How can we coordinate in this European community to weigh on this debate at the global level? That's what I wanted to say by way of an introduction. And I really want to wish you all a very enjoyable and fruitful day of discussions. Thank you very much for having organized this event.
Thank you, Olivier. There were some reactions in the chat during your introduction. There was a question about the links and synergies between NGI and the GAIA-X project. Could you tell us in a few words what GAIA-X is? Well, it's not an initiative of the Commission. It is an initiative of 2 member states, Germany and France. And that involves a lot of stakeholders, a lot of industrial players, and that aims at standardization and interoperability in the field of cloud computing. For the time being, there's not been a lot of discussions with GAIA-X, the initiative that we tried to put in place within the Commission. It's in parallel with NGI. It's the Alliance for the cloud, and the objective is to develop infrastructures. So it's quite complementary with what GAIX is doing. But my idea, and the idea that we've got with my colleagues, and we will talk about it with the GAIX team soon, is to try and understand how this initiative can benefit from the developments made by our innovators, and possibly how our innovators can use the infrastructures developed by the partners of GAIX or by the partners of the Cloud Alliance to develop new services, open source. So it is a conversation that we still have to have, but I think it is an important one. Very good. Thank you very much, Olivier, for this introduction, and have a very good day. Stay with us if your agenda allows you to. I'm going to turn to Gilles Babinet now, a digital champion for France at the European Commission. About the subject, we'd like to know how you follow these issues of interoperability. Hello. Well, first, I'd like to thank you for organizing this debate. It is essential, so congratulations, and thank you to all of the organizers. This issue of interoperability and the web of platforms is very central. It's very technical. It is what Olivier just recalled, but it is also very political, as he also said. So it is very important that we understand the framework of it. I think, well, this situation is about particular for those who have got some gray hair and who have seen the history of the development of the internet. We went from a vision in the 90s that was very dystopic from a political point of view. It was the end of the story. There was some kind of unification, not technological, but with a democratic will at the scale of the planet. It wasn't the case. And from a technological point of view, there were people like Thomas Friedman, who wrote and claimed the fact that the world was becoming flat, because we're all equidistant in terms of access to knowledge. And from that utopia stemmed a dystopia, a political one, with technologies that are used to control population, in particular in China, but also in many other countries, and a concentration of economic power in the hands of the platforms. And we are aware of that today. There's a good understanding of the subject, but the issue is to try and go beyond. I think it is important to utter the main themes on which platforms and the ownership of data express themselves. There's the economic aspect. Olivier just reminded us of the importance of network effect. It was misunderstood for a long time. It's something that contributed to it is the fact that curricula in management schools or engineering schools didn't know that principle. And even if it was described and discussed at length, it was an informal way. It didn't reach what the main university curricula had reached. So, and that had consequences in terms of strategic planning. We didn't see that the European fragmentation reduced the length of the takeoff tarmac, and it reduced the capacity of Europe to create unicorns and platforms as they appeared afterwards. The other issue that was also very much discussed That's one of the allocation of data, the issue of privacy. And through GDPR, of the issues of reallocation of the destination of data. And it is obvious that that debate is still living, even though we've got now a regulatory framework that is quite robust. And Olivier just shared with us an analysis of GDPR. It is still developing, especially in relation to compliance ethics and machine learning. There's some thought being given to that within the Commission. And as a consequence of the platforms, there are tax issues. The virtualization of economy had a strong impact on the capacity of some players to escape taxes, to evade taxes. It's more the framework of the OECD, but it is essential. It's a matter of equity of citizens in vis-a-vis platforms. And the new American context is welcome in this regard. Even if they said that the condition for the debate is not to lose, but it is the recognition of the externality of platforms that was not taken into account. And there's also social issues with platform workers. There again, the Commission addresses this issue. And that's a debate that will be, during the whole of the 21st century. There's a correlation of the distribution of value between capital and labor. It's interesting to realize that this decorrelation starts with a technological act that is the one of the synchronization of financial markets that was made possible thanks to technology. When you've got Canada and the US that started in 1976 to integrate the financial markets, there's a lack of symmetry between the allocation of capital and the allocation of labor, and people went towards where it was more profitable. And it is a subject that concerns us, that concerns our debate, because the social impact is also the acceptance of technology in its broad lines. And I come to a subject that is of interest to me. You can see that very quickly I'm talking about this subject. They're independent from one another. You've got, the political, in the political sphere, we'll look at social aspects. In engineering schools, it will be about portability of data and interoperability of data. But I think that there's a need to have cross-cutting understanding of the subjects, because it's very difficult to manage to deal with them in an isolated and separate manner, at least not in an efficient way. And there's got to be some pluridisciplinarity. That is, you can graduate from an engineering school, but you also have got to take into account other aspects. You shouldn't become, obviously, an expert of public policies, but you should have at least the start of an understanding of those issues, because we can see that finally, everything being related, the fact of understanding the moment. Hello? Will allow to have a stronger impact. I observe that the subject of architecture, maybe in the debate, I'm thinking of Jean-François, Abramatic, there will be different assessments, but the issue of architectures as such was abandoned, was put aside. you'll know this definition of the full stack programmer, the guy who is very versatile. We didn't get interested in the subject of architectures. It comes back today because we can see that its strategic dimension and political one of that is fundamental. And also there were big recent innovations. I'm thinking of Tumen test that redefine the function of the architecture. We could talk about APIs also that are quite fashionable. S3, for example, we talked about other subjects in that regard. And I think that it's interesting because architectures have defined the web. They were very fashionable in the 60s and 70s. I'm thinking of Louis and who with his cycler network had a vision, a very interesting vision of architectures. And there's that there was a domination of a certain type of architecture, and it comes back with the issue of cybersecurity. We've got to have a broader view than it's one's own computer. And I think that it is at the convergence of many issues that I've just talked about. And behind all of these notions, there's a return of regulations with GDPR. We talked about it, and Olivier has said also with DSA, DMA, scopes of which are different. I think that DMA is more an issue at the heart of the discussion of today, especially with regard to the way we can recreate fair conditions of access to data. I would encourage you to read the preliminary text of DMA as it was drafted by the Commission. It's very interesting because it's accessible by everybody, and it lays very finely the what is at stake. And I think it is difficult to get out of this paradigm because it is well laid out, and it recalls the very political nature, which is at the heart of interoperability of platforms. So it is a political issue. Once we've said that, what does it mean? For example, there's a definition of commons that is based on standards, but there's a debate that is complex about should data be part of the commons. Today we've got health crisis, we're in the middle of a health crisis, and we can see that data that can be very personal, like have I caught COVID-19, etc. So we are all interested in that, and that's part of commons. So anonymized health data, is it truly anonymized? It's very complex. It's one of the debates that are the most complicated. So the word pseudo-anonymized was invented. There's also something else that is essential that Olivier talked about. It's what should be the European innovation model. We can see that there are different innovation models in the planet. Some that are quite militarized in China and Israel, in the US, that have a certain level of efficiency. Should those models be closed or open? And behind that, I think there's something that is of interest. That is, we are reaching a first level of maturity of the internet. And I tend to sum up by saying, how do you go from 1% to 10%? How do you make sure there's not anymore the elite in the different countries that create innovations? It's what you see in China, Israel, the US. So a very small elite can do that if we want to make sure that it's more democratic, and that those technologies turn towards the common good. well, there's that issue that's been discussed for 40 years, is to create a society of knowledge. And how do you create systems, educational systems, sharing, knowledge sharing systems that could be massified? The debate still's got to move on, because the models that are prevailing, we could say the MOOC platforms are very good, DAPA, the great foundations that finance open source, those are old models, and it's interesting to try and see what is the next shot. How can we create platforms of open science that will go beyond the code, for example, because as I said, it is pluridisciplinary, and it goes through really a work of exchange, of a pluridisciplinary exchange from a university academic point of view, but also from the point of view of a platform of information sharing. And it also touches on a subject that's complicated, that is how, it's controversial, but how do we get out of a fundamental research from out of a world that is purely academic? We can see it's complicated to have just anybody in code. There are people who participate in big code programs that is not only academic people. Somebody told me my job today is more being a travel agency to go to invite people to go and talk than to be an actual researcher. And we are surprised by the fact that people who participate in the main in those big conferences do that, and so we should stop having preconceived ideas about what doesn't really exist. I read an article about a scientific method, and apparently it doesn't exist. But how can the European space create its own model of research, its own model of innovation, and how can we make sure that that model be for the common good? I will conclude by saying a word about the fact that we are all aware of the power of digital era, and I don't know how we can not take into account the other breakthrough, that is the environmental aspect. I think that success would be due to choices made in terms of innovation model. And in relation to that, there's the choice you make in terms of data sharing. So I'd like to thank you for being present. I'd like to thank the organizers, and I hope this debate will be fruitful, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you. Thank you, Gilles, for this introduction with a number of keywords: common good, the importance of transfer, technological transfer, the importance of environmental issues, and that will be addressed in the debate we're going to start now. I would like to invite Michiel de Jong and Odile Chagny to join us to present the speakers of this roundtable about interoperability as means for rebuilding the web. Michiel, you've got the floor, as well as Odile. Yeah, we're delighted with Michiel to start this day to go deeper into the questions that have been mentioned by speakers that we'd like to thank. What we suggest, as we've got a limited time until noon, and with different constraints, time for discussion, because it would allow all of the participants to have a dialogue outside of the chat. So we propose to structure the debate with the four speakers already introduced by Antoine. So to in 4 steps, first to talk about the technological aspects, second to talk about concrete aspects of the impact that interoperability may have, and conclude with a discussion about the issues of governance and levers of public policy to activate that was mentioned before, and to finish with a discussion between all participants. So do not hesitate to raise your hand. We also we're going to organize a survey during the roundtable, so it's also a means to participate. Yes, thank you, Antoine. So what we suggest is to start this roundtable with the technological aspects. Jean-François, Abramatic, you are one of the contributed to the creation of the discussion, and maybe you may react to what was said by Olivier Branger and the next and following keynote speaker. So please be brief to allow most people to speak.
So I'm going to refer to the past. I'm an emeritus research director, so that means I'm retired, and so I don't have a legitimacy. I don't have a mandate. Over these last few years, I've been focused on other subjects. So it's great that I'm in this role as to. I know that everyone who is in this conference is seeking solutions for the future. I understand that fully. But I'm going to take a few minutes to look at the past to see what we can learn from the past in order to build the future. That could be useful. At least that's what I'm going to attempt to do. So in order to talk simply, the internet celebrated its 50th anniversary 2 years ago. The web, it was 30, about the same time. Between the two, I'm going to mention the Exminio system, who is 40 years old and which is still used in the environment without people necessarily being aware of it. The ETF is the internet infrastructures. And then we've got the interface and machines, the web. I don't need to define it, except that it is the place where the applications are being developed. And so here, this is where we make contact with the user, the contact in the information system. So these 3 environments were developed, and I'm going to try and look at these 3 different environments from the perspective of interoperability. With regard to internet and the LTF, the key for interoperability was to say that in recommendation standards documents, a document became a norm from the point that it could be shown that there were 2 implementations which were interoperable in the verification. And it was only when we had those two interoperable implementations that the norm was validated and so forth. In the context of this Windows system, the subject was a bit more focused, and the means used was the reference code. So the person who was running the project supported for the general community, produced this reference code, which was then used by app developers in order to insert it into the machine interaction system and the X Windows system. In the W3C, the web, the idea was that the consortium inherited a lot from the X Window consortium, the kind of the mother, if you like, of MIT. The idea of using the reference code was mentioned, and so the decision was taken to concentrate on this, which produced the W3C and to make recommendations for implementers. So these three ways of going about things, if we try and look at what we can learn for the future, are that we were working towards a technical commonality so that all the community could develop, from developers through to users. So as one of the problems mentioned was that we are now, and currently time is moving on. The ecosystem is evolving, and so we're seeing the emergence of these platforms which have not followed the same route, and so have created walled gardens and which create problems with regard to interoperability. So I would like to remind everyone that, I think this is a case, is a question of balance between four major stakeholders, four major categories of stakeholders, which were mentioned by Gilles and Olivier. The academic world, which played a very important role within the context of the three systems that we've already mentioned. Industry, who develops the products, governments, and civil society. And of course, the balance over years have changed. We're not looking at the same balances between these four major categories of stakeholders with regard to the deployment of systems, and consequently their characteristics with regard to interoperability. For example, the current leaders, IBM, Digital Equipment, ATT, and Microsoft, when the web became developed and was developed initially by CERN, it was they who demanded the creation of a consortium. They came to see MIT saying, we need neutral terrain where we can discuss about interoperability. This phenomenon was not produced without the definers, those who define platforms, Apple's, Google, and so forth. They didn't go and see a stakeholder in order to develop a neutral terrain. On the contrary, they developed in a proprietary way their own application environments, and they made choices in their relationships with developers to open or not, and so they have complete control over the choices, the architectural choices, because one of the elements in architecture, what's available to everyone and what remains localized in a specific place. So this mechanism was not reproduced. So there was no determination, no desire to go and find neutral ground in the context of W3C, explicitly involving academic organizations. X Window, for example, which remained MIT with Tim Berners-Lee, requested that the consortium develop this, the World Wide Web was genuinely worldwide. And the places, there were three places which were neutral, where recommendations could be created and made, and the recommendations that we're now fully aware of. Julien has just mentioned mentioned some of the initiatives currently underway in that regard. And so we can see that these mechanisms did not take place. This neutral ground was not defined. And that's created the problem we're currently seeing. So having said that, if the things are developing and the challenges, we should never forget that since internet, the challenge that we are facing is we have to develop architecture, but also above all to develop software architectures. Obviously, they are implemented by material, but the architecture is software. And as one is this capitalization aspect. That means that currently we use code written by DCP/IP 10 years ago, and we're no longer worried about it because these things have become ripe and mature without even understanding what they're based on. And then we have elements, and the web elements, which they themselves are made available to everyone. So this capitalization results in us seeing new challenges arise. Whereas the web of protection of private data, the subject has now become critical, or became critical as soon as applications manipulating data massively, data involving personal data. And whether we get organized or we don't get organized, but above the way in which which is used in order to deploy infrastructure, how can I put this, is critical and has consequences on interoperability and so on services provided to users. I think we'll be tackling this in the afternoon. Tim, before he created NOAP, he worked on the development and tried to tackle those questions. The deployment isn't currently there. It was rather more potential than a reality on the market. And this is one of the avenues in terms of architecture or comparative routes that could be taken into consideration. I'm going to conclude on one element that was given me by Gilles' presentation. In order for the university world to become interested in a subject, there has to be a meeting between ideas, potential ideas, that researchers can work on, and an objective. For example, people who were doing telecommunications protocols 50 years ago, their objective was to have computers communicate together. And they were working on independent computers. They wanted to bring the computers together, and they created the internet for that purpose. Within the context of the web, Tim wanted information systems, available information in several different places, knowledge, to be able to be shared. I believe a lot in open science over the last few years. This is the subject I have spent most of my time on. And the European level program, the European Science Cloud, for example, that are currently being deployed on that subject. I think it'd be easier to bring the world of university research into a new adventure and to lead them to that if the objectives themselves, if the objectives have consequences on the academic world. And I think in open sciences is a way of bringing into the concert which Gilles has been mentioning. It's a way of bringing scientists back into this world, into this consortium of civil society, industry, and government. So that's the link that I wanted to establish between my experience in the past and the way in which recommendations or advice can be made for the future. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean-François. This gives us a panorama, which is both broad and including the what's at stake and the different stakeholders involved. I think we will not have the possibility of going into all the questions which are being broached this morning. I see that the poll has told us there's several questions, but from the time being, when we ask you, participants, what is the impact that you see on this subject? It's most on personal data. So we're going to offer in the second phase of the discussion, discussion around the impacts on industrial issues, which are also at the heart of the questions we want to deploy within this cycle of events, which are poorly understood or little known. What is it about industrial data, about competition, about innovation, restructuration of value supply chains? So the questions that have been already evoked, I'm going to hand over now to Alain, Assouline, and Antoine Garnier for them to talk to us about their experience as stakeholders in this transformation. As president of CINOV and as project manager for the International Data Space Association, the IDSA. So Alain, Assouline, first of all, over to you for, sorry, you have a few minutes. The time is short, but that allows for discussion. Yes, of course, I'm going to tackle this discussion. Hello, everyone. I am intervening here, and I believe that the contact has been established. Both as a representative, the president of CINOV, this is an enterprise of digital businesses, but for some time now, I am at the head of the CPM Digital Commission. And we have joined this discussion around the Digital Market Act in the preparation that we were to have with our European Commissioner. We have tried to feed back to the different federations of the CPME, the different types of business and the different professions, what were the issues, the problems, the questions that arose or that are arising. And what was immediate and massive, and each person in their own way said that it was the question of platforms, and in particular, the question of experience in the world of hotels and catering, but also in sales, commerce, the question of saying in reality, these platforms retain our data, they keep their our customers, we don't have access to our own customers, and there's a problem with the identification of digital identity when people are paying. So here I'm tackling the subjects which are extremely concrete very directly. And in reality for us, there's an issue in which we are very engaged over the last 2-3 years with Fonchune, and that's the question of supporting the transformation, digital transformation of these small businesses, which is important for them, but which is also important at the national and European level, in particular in France, because we're running late. And obviously, with regard to this question of digital transformation of small businesses, there is an answer which is easy, which presented by platforms, which is often to say, well, if you come onto our platform, you don't need a website. Everything's there. You'll have everything there. You have all the tools necessary to display your products, to have logistics and payment agreement, all data is set. And I've written a chronicle on this subject with the director of the FNIC. And we think that the question of digital autonomy of businesses, this meaning the businesses, and particularly small businesses, because the big businesses, they were proof capable of doing that. But for the multitude of small businesses that we have in France and Europe, the question of the construction of their digital autonomy is fundamental. And it is obvious that it can only be achieved if there is a portability of data. And that is where, obviously, I think that in our discussions, these questions are very important. What's obvious is that for the time being, and I'm very interested in what's going to be said about the web post platform. What we're seeing is for a small business or small shopkeepers to hotel keepers, we're telling them you need to have your own website. You need to have your autonomous life on the web. But obviously, currently, platforms and social networks, it's like the air we breathe on internet. And that a business who says, I'm not going to go there, it will be cut itself completely off from our resource, the customer resource, and the way that it can contact them. So the question now is, this is the state in which we're in. The question is, people's own websites, but we have to inherit it in order to create this possibility of being both to not be dependent on the very big platforms, but also trying to promote the possibility of developing territorial local cycles. This is a genuine subject. If we look at the question, I'll take two examples of this. If I look at a butcher that has his own website, very often the people who want to buy his products will use the marketplace that they know, so the shopkeeper's marketplace, in order to go, because then there's delivery which will follow. So the idea is to say how, when someone has gone to buy or through a platform with such and such a butcher's, how can the butcher continue to maintain a relationship with that customer that came to see them? We've seen this case at much greater scale, because people are very angry in the world of hotel keepers, because the platforms have seized the customers. That it's very difficult to change things now, because for those platforms, it's their economic model. And so the question is very difficult. But in any case, their economic model is, first of all, their data, and to conserve those data. And so we have situations where when the customer is not in the hotel or at the reception desk, the hotel doesn't know who the customer is. And if the customer calls and says, I'm going to arrive a little late and so forth, the hotel doesn't know who is that person they're speaking to. And so these issues have become really considerable. The second question that I'm very much interested in, and I'll take an example of that in my business, we have HR tools online, but for example, for management on one-to-one, we've deployed a very small tool which was produced just before the COVID crisis, which, you know, it involves check-ins between managers and those who are managed, and has become vital for remote working. So this is a tool which is very specialized. So the question of making all these tools interoperable should make it possible which should allow us to develop specialized tools, interoperable tools, rather than a big thing that's very hard to maintain. And I think that this is one of the questions that we need to look at within the context of the digital transformation of the state. And we can't say that the state in digital has not spent millions and millions for its digital transformation. But even so, the things are running very late in that regard as well. So with regard to solving this, the simplification of tools, the multiplicity of small tools which are easily manageable and which are easy to update and which are interoperable amongst themselves, that's a solution. So for us, the question of interoperability for small businesses involves offering people a choice of changing tools, changing platforms, to be free to decide where I go. So this would allow me to develop my own autonomy, to be able to go from one tool to another, is to be able to have several tools visible, and each of them specialized in their own domains. And also with this trend of low code, the possibility of creating my own tools, but which would allow me to be adjust things to my own, tailor things to my own personal needs, and to avoid having SMEs getting locked into a tool or a platform, and which makes them completely dependent. I think that the what's at stake for the small business is what's at stake for our territories, because they're the lifeblood of our territories, and so that everything that I'm saying around the relationship with the ecological transformation, this close relationship. So there's obviously things at stake with regard to digital energy use and so forth, but there are also use-related challenges which are very substantial, because digital can be a fantastic way of developing short loops, developing local, geographically close connections and relationships, and around the capacity for small businesses to be able to develop an autonomy in the internet space. Thank you very much, Alain.
Thank you very much, Alain.
So, what we see here is what's at stake with regard to the articulation between global and local.
And a number of participants.
We can see this as a regional effect, but it will
election. So it may be some food for thought.
Gives us a perspective on the French scale of what's at stake with regard to the implementation around a certain number of the implementation of these solutions. So between global and local, I'm going to hand over to Antoine Garnier in order to tackle this. So Antoine Garnier, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to tell you what we do at IDSA, International Data Spaces Association. I'm based in Paris, but the association was started in Germany. It is becoming more international now in Europe mainly, but also outside of Europe. In France, we are represented by Bouygues Telecom. That's an interesting piece of information to know. there are people who work on the subjects of the association in France. Also, there are hubs that exist outside. And with INT, we are founding members of Garnier X, something that was mentioned before. And an historical side, because the subject was mentioned also, IDSA stems from a research project in Germany about 5 years ago, and that was industrial data space. And the result of the project about data sharing was presented to industrialists who decided to set up that association to of interoperability based on the sovereignty of data. That's the principle of data sovereignty that we support, and that made it possible to make that transfer of technology between research, the research world and industry. So to have a link between research and industry, hoping that it could offer a way with this introduction and say a few words about what we do. IDSA develops and promotes a standard of data sharing, as I was saying, based on the sovereignty of data. As the question was about the impact of interoperability, and that there's a number of historical reminders that have been made right before me, I would like to take advantage of this to say, well, it doesn't matter. What I wish to tell you, to show you, was to show you the evolution of the type of data shared. It was recalled by the previous speakers. It's an element that we like to recall, and that is in the main document that the association produces, the referent architecture. It is at the core of what we produce. I'm going to put a link in the chat for those who are interested. There you go. So what I was going to tell you about data sharing is that for about 30 years now, we've seen the evolution, well, since the exchange of DIs, the well, information about in bills, sending notifications between companies, down to information about sensing, IoT more recently today. And what we try to make emerge with IDSA, that's more sensitive information, production chain between companies, information that is more sensitive and that requires a way to control the use that is made of the data to make sure that we keep control over the data. So that's a small introduction. In terms of impact, we think that the type of information that is going to be exchanged is fundamentally different from what was done in the past, in the sense that that's information that is more and more sensitive, that is shared between different participants. So first, the type of information, also participants, that is to say that if I take the example of EDI, you know, people agreed between companies to share a certain type of data, invoices and so, but those were specific agreements between companies. The idea and what we push forward with IDSA and that standard is the capacity to share data that can be sensitive with players that are possibly unknown before the exchange is made. So on the basis of certification of the players who become trustworthy players, but with the idea of the sovereignty of data, that is, I can control in a certain way the use that is going to be made of the data, and then I agree to share the said data, even though it might be sensitive. And what we see today is that the first agreements on the subject, we've got to chains, like in the automotive industry, we talked about Gaia X before. In Germany, the automotive manufacturers agreed upon Catenet X. I'm going to put the link, Catenet X. So those are the platforms, there are the manufacturers gather around a table with all of their, rank 1 and 2 suppliers to agree upon interoperability standards in order to exchange data at the core of the chains and obtain benefits in terms of optimization, efficiency of production, or maintenance, for example. Those are very topical subjects in the discussions on Catena, but it's also the case of logistics. Another case that I wanted to mention that is what is going on in the Netherlands with the project that's called Smart Connected Supplier Network. It's a rather long acronym. It's a project that is in logistics and that gather several hundreds of players of logistics and who exchange data in a decentralized manner. So you don't have any more a platform, a centralized player that would manage the exchange of data, but it is done in a decentralized way. So that's based on IDSA. The first IDSA is not very far from Catenet X, even though it is being discussed still. So those are two examples that show that we are starting to address very important issue for industry, because it's about exchange of sensitive data in a decentralized manner, allowing possibly to reach a certain dimension of fairness between players who've got access to the system of exchange. And anyway, this is where we will have the opportunity to discuss afterwards. There's a number of conditions for that interoperability. At IDSA, what we support, it's the sovereignty of data. So the control of the use of the data, it is at the core of the project, supported by Solid. We are not the only ones in Europe to talk about that. But I think we'll get back to this subject later on. Thank you. Thank you very much, Antoine. What I suggest is that we get to a time for a discussion about these issues of governance and of the levers to activate. We've got to think interoperability in a broader context, and there's the issue of governance, but also education. Education, it's comes up very clearly. People have got to be made aware of the impact of those issues. So I suggest we use this time to maybe sum up the main messages that you'd like to convey to all of the participants in terms of levers to activate. You touched upon that already, all of you. So levers to activate to make sure that interoperability becomes a reality. What is to be activated? What are the main messages you'd like to convey, including to public authorities, to companies and citizens? So, Gilles, maybe you may start the discussion. Jean-François, Abramatic, Alain, and Antoine. So please be concise so that we've got enough time for a good discussion. Gilles, okay, message to public authorities. It is a historical time with a recovery plan that is, unprecedented. It may surprise you because it may not talk about technological directions. We've got to aim at the long run. So to make sure that we give back some momentum to the Bologna process that was quite virtuous in the European university academic system. It's something to be wished for. And I think I've got, you can see the start of the integration of European research. I'm surprised to observe that there's a dissemination of means, and that if we manage to have some coordination at the European scale, it'd be more efficient, particularly in regards to what we're concerned about today. So it would be to develop that integration at the European level. It would be a copy and paste of what you see in other countries. And I think that we've got to give some thought to what is breakthrough innovation in the 21st century. I met the directors of Interpa, and they criticize their own model. They say it's got plenty of faults, it's got to be renovated, we've got to do something different. But the hint that the system actually works, and it's complicated to develop a new one. I'm surprised to see many initiatives of European ERPA that are caricatures of what exists with means that are limited. And so I think that instead of copying what was done 60 years ago, we should think again about it. And last thing, the program that is the most virtuous in the European Union is that program that I forgot the name of exchange in the EEA. Erasmus, yeah. So to have a digital Erasmus, it was discussed for a long time. I don't think it was done. But when you take, well, so somebody, whatever the discipline of computer science that is led to study in another country, externalities measured by Erasmus, it was the most successful program at in Europe. That's huge, starting with trans-European weddings. I'm a bit surprised, in fact, that we don't see this momentum. And one of the reasons, I think, is that there's still little European sovereignty, and the time is a very long one. So the political reward comes up decades later. So you've got to be courageous to commit to it. Thanks a lot. Yeah, we've got more than 2 or 3 leads with you. So I would like to give the floor to Jean-François Abramatic. Yes, thank you. First comment on the basis of what has just been said. I think we've got to pay attention, especially with regard to the allocation of credits and subsidies in Europe and at the national level. We've got to think about the vision of what are the true global problems and the local ones. That's essential. There are things that have got to be solved at the local level with application, environment, developments that have got a purpose locally. So to imagine that in a world that uses the web, everything's got to be decided in a centralized manner in Brussels or Washington or elsewhere, it's to be totally mistaken. There are tasks that have got to be done globally, others locally. And we should think about it. That's got to be, you know, a framework of thinking. Second thing is to make progress the environment, is to make the environment progress in general. We've got to identify the main challenges that have got a global dimension. And they are the most complex to address. And I reiterate my message. I think that all of the efforts in open science, because they are representative of complex challenges, they have all of the components of what we you see in civil life, protection of privacy. It is an obvious matter in open science, you know, in terms of health, etc. So what I mean to say is that the global project has got difficulties that will be useful in a general way. And the third, and I'm not going to repeat myself, I want to insist on the fact that cooperation is of the essence when we try to put in place measures. The effort that is the most recent and most spectacular, that's GDPR. That's an example of an approach that is clearly necessary. There's no discussion about it. But the devil is in the detail. To have legal or regulatory elements, that's important. It sets things on which the community agrees. But in the world we live in, we also have got to think about implementation. And in the same way as the software and digital environment created the problem, I think that the software and digital environment will contribute to solve it. And at the same time as we develop regulatory elements like GDPR, I think we've got to build a technical capacity to address the problem. And it's not done today. In my role, scientist, if I've got to have a utopic vision, I am dreaming, I'm 72, of a law, a regulation that would be simultaneously developed in its text form and in the form of the implementation of digital tools necessary to make sure that the said regulation is not only a bureaucratic decision. I think we do not think enough about the conjunction, the representation of decision in a text form and in the form of the development of tools necessary for its implementation. You're on mute.
So I'm getting back to what Jean-François is saying. In reality, if we don't do things conjointly, if we don't take decisions together around the regulatory issues with the establishment of tools or the fact of promoting tools, I think we won't get there. And I see in the chat someone who's saying, yeah, the website, we have, that's old fashioned, we have to get beyond that. Obviously, I'm aware of that. And the whole issue that we have is that now the digital world is made up of websites, applications, social networks, of platforms, of all sorts of platforms. And so the question, no, I'm getting back to this. Find a way through all this is how can they exist without being subjected to a whole number of things? How can they maintain a good quality customer relationship? How can they sell their products without being taxed either by a platform or by another type of tool? And how can they avoid being completely dependent on all that? So I think that there's an issue around regulations, and the Digital Market Act is one of the that's tackled within the Digital Market Act. But I also think of all the technological challenge, and that's where I locate the question of interoperability. How can we ensure that the user, the business, can have the choice of changing tool, changing platform, without telling themselves, if I leave this platform, I'm going to lose a whole history that I've generated? How can we allow them and the second question is the tools I use. How can I use several different types of application, of different types of tool with specific specializations? How can I create my own tools? How can I generate my own independence with regard to the creation of my own digital tools? And in reality, that's what's really at stake. Of course, there's that issue, because, and I'm talking about it because of where I am as president of the Commission of the CPMEs, but we'll find the same types of question around the questions of freedom, information. We'll find those on all the other subjects, and so I am. I think it's correct that we have these regulations, but these regulations in reality are not finding their real incarnation and will not, as long as it's the big platforms that dominate on the internet. So we need to develop alternatives to all that. Thank you very much, Alain. I would suggest, Antoine, that you conclude this part of the roundtable, because I think that there will be debate with all the participants, and I would encourage everyone to raise their hands if they wish to intervene. I think there are a lot of comments in the chat, and the idea is to really to launch a discussion. Over to you, Antoine. Thank you very much. By way of a conclusion, I'm going to try and have try to make it appropriate. For what I see with regard to the point of our association, which is industrial, we talk about technological interoperability. What I am seeing is, and what could be the start of my little intervention here, is around the conversion between the importance of personal data and industrial data. By that, I mean that in both cases, the question of sovereignty comes back regularly. So this capacity to control and to monitor, to master the data and their use. And so this continuum of data we see in the discussions that we have with other initiatives at the European level. I'm talking about My Data in Finland, iShare in the Holland, in the Netherlands, and Citra in Finland as well. These are things are often return, and so this question of sovereignty. And when we talk about controlling the use of data, this is a theme which returns both with regard to this data strategy developed by the Commission in the European Union and Data Governance Act, but also in the Gaia X initiative. This is one of the 4 pillars on which the European initiative is based. And so this really is at the heart of the matter. So I'll take advantage of this just to do a bit of advertising, because I think this is appropriate with regard to our discussion and burning questions. We've just developed a position paper called Design People for Data Space with some 40 experts and initiatives and civil society groups that I've just mentioned, in which we call for a certain number of things: the promotion of sovereignty, but which is based on an essential subject, what we call a soft infrastructure, which is neither more nor less not having a monolithic centralized structure which regulates the web, but a set of interoperable elements which are naturally distributed and regulated by agreements between the different stakeholders, the people who will decide to exchange these data, and the techniques and the role that the different people occupy in this ecosystem. How will this work legally, economically, as well as technically? So, and how is value shared? And this will allow, as we were saying earlier, allow us to focus on interoperability, portability, discoverability, and compliance with data, and with regard to privacy, privacy in English, and also trust between the different stakeholders in this. So that's the heart of the document, the research I've just published. And what we call for is that in the coming decade, we will need, both at the European level and at the state level, and this is what we're beginning to see with the Gaia initiative, which is translated at the level of states with calls for projects. We've seen this in the chat as well. We find these key words in the European calls for tender and research projects. So the phase of regulation in order to guide the market, but also of financial support in order to allow what we are perceiving as a phase of convergence initially between the different initiatives which exist at the European level on the subject of interoperability. They're numerous. We're all pretty close on the way in the way we approach this, but it's important to talk from the same, sing from the same sheet. And once we've dealt with that convergence, we need to see the deployment, and this will be the longest phase, the deployment of this interoperability to this data space, which is the concept when we talk about data exchange, and which accompanies the financing this first data space. What will it finance? The authentication, traceability, subjects around certification. No one wants to pay for that, but it costs money. And so these are positions that need to be supported. And once the value has been showed at business level, then there will be stakeholders who will be involved, and they'll get others to pay. And there'll be business relays which will emerge and which will be associated with that. Last point with this rollout is the awareness subjects, the importance of becoming engaged. So this is the link between the continuum between personal data and industrial data, the education policy, which we've already mentioned by the previous speakers. And finally, a figure with, we know this is to be taken with precaution. It's about between 1.2 billion, 1.5 billion and 2 billion. You know, these are the figures that would be required in terms. I've tried to be concise. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Michiel, who has a question to ask you all. And I would suggest that the different speakers, I've identified a certain number, who've asked specific questions. Pierre Bouvier-Muller, you've asked a question. So I'd like you to take the floor and ask your question. So Michiel, over to you. You have the floor.
Hi, yeah, I'd be interested in what link you see between the lack of interoperability in the technologies that we see built by unicorns who built these platforms with they have this hockey stick economics, right? So they become very popular and they get lots of customers which they lock into their platform, and that's why they're so valued capitalistically. But if you look at other business models that maybe from the degrowth movement, which is I think is also quite a European thing, and the sustainability movement in general, where maybe if you look at, for instance, co-ops and businesses that see themselves, that try to be maybe more like a tree in a forest rather than being a cancer that just keeps growing. If the business model of the companies that produce our technology is different, could that also help to give them an intrinsic motivation to be interoperable with other technological companies and instead of trying to dominate and build a walled garden? To any of the speakers who wants to comment on that.
I could say a word to that. This subject, with regard to the valuation of data and optimal organization for its valuation, I think this has been very poorly understood. The reality is that meta platforms will emerge and they'll be able to modify what data is used for. You do a search, then you do a mail. On the basis of mail, then you do a mapping, and then you do geolocation and so forth. And this valuation of data makes it possible for Amazon to get into cinema, and for 4 years they get 10 billion in turnover. This is never been seen before. We're aware of that. On the other hand, I'm aware that we talked to a few people here who talked about industrial data. I think it's important to remind ourselves that in terms of industrial data and the industrial system, Europe is dominant with things like people like IBB, Schneider, Siemens, who are leaders in market segments in the industrial domain. And one of the factors which allows them and has allowed them hitherto to control that domination is the fact that their data is only difficult, is very hard, it's difficult for it to be interoperable. This irritates us a bit, because I think that everyone can see how virtuous data sharing is, but we have to recognize that there is a phase around emergence in which these stakeholders and their domination is the consequence of the control of that data, of those data. So we are in a world which is brutal, where we need sovereignty, we need meta platforms, and so that runs up against what we are seeing. And this is what I said when I talked about the first web utopia, which was very granular, where the technologies were distributed. There was a granular entity which could be created. I think what's at stake here is, when I talk about doing post-architecture, that means having these two worlds cohabit, to have meta platforms which are powerfully regulated, which are orchestrators, and then below that you have granular organisms which shouldn't just get kind of completely shaved, as we've talked about in the tourism domain, and which we can no longer reestablish them in a position in which they are not abused by a dominator. So as I was saying earlier, we need to be in a position to articulate those who develop technologies and those who understand the rights and the economies of competition and are capable of understanding technological architectures and economic architectures that we could deploy in the near future. And the determination to have a strong control over this in order to allow us to get there. But I think we can do this, but it may take, there's a lot to do before we get there. Would anyone else like to make a comment? Yes, I can say something about this too, Jean-François. Can you hear me? Yes. The first thing is, once again, I'm the guy with the whitest hair here. There have been other moments in the emergence of digital where there were dominant parties, and we considered that they had unattackable fortresses. IBM, case in point, IBM still exists, but they completely reinvented themselves. You went from hardware to services. You know, they used their position as an established business to reinvent themselves, but they're no longer the same business. Their presence is different. Digital equipment no longer exists. ATT, you know, the regulation in the communications world has had their effect. They were broken up. Microsoft is no longer considered to be the business it was. Well, it's still the second biggest capitalization in the stock market behind Apple. So it's interesting to see that it's the businesses from the 1980s that are number one currently. Amazon, Google, Facebook are running behind them. So the fact that there are major stakeholders. That's always existed. I recognize, and how can I put this? Time has accelerated. These leaders become leaders much faster than their predecessors did. And the current leaders become leaders faster than their predecessors did. But I think that, first of all, if they become leaders, it means they're offering services to customers who come and use their services. So Google, you know, a search engine is useful. So a lot of people on this call who will be using search engines very regularly and who consider that the service rendered is positive. So, you know, again, I'm not pleading my own case. I'm retired, as I've said, but we need to, you know, if we look at this with objectively, you know, these stakeholders are important because they render a service which their customers like and use. So the question is, how can we ensure and how can we moderate the secondary effects or even the primary effects of their presence in the marketplace? I'm convinced that there is no other means than having emerged stakeholders of the subsequent generation. I think that the first point in the route to a liberation, well, liberation is perhaps a big word, to the control of the role of platforms on the ecosystem is generation, and to ensure that they become major actors. That's a kind of meta approach, but if we look at history, I don't see any other way of dealing things with the legacy that we have. You know, we have inherited this history, and I don't see how else you can be present with regard to future opportunities. If I may intervene, I would like to just pursue what's being said. This is obviously a subject which is at the heart of what we do in GDSN. The interoperability and reintroducing a form of equity, fairness between participants in a data exchange. This is central as an issue, and we have a tendency to aim at those who we call the cyberscalers. So the platforms, be the American or Chinese, but there are examples which are closer to home. Siemens, for example, we've mentioned them as being a means of maintaining value. And so to prevent the sharing of data, so everyone who is beneath them, they are part of that value chain. To allow people to retain management of data, and the people who are less far away from us, like Airbus with their project, what's it called? Sky 222. Sorry, I can't remember their name. It's a platform which was designed to share the data of all the value chain in the aeronautical industry, and which encountered significant problems. And so I think, you know, this will be the position of the association that I'm trying to present. So these national foreign stakeholders who are very monopolistic, it's not so much them. The problem is that whatever the size of the stakeholder, it's important that we can introduce fairness in order to allow everyone to have access to these data and to have future issues emerge, as perhaps Jean-François Abramatic has just been saying. And so to allow us to imagine what comes next. So as a result, I'm going to get back. There's a question asked by Patrick in the chat directly, Antoine, and around data brokers and their role in data space. Then we'll move on to other questions. This was in the chat. I hope that I'm not interpreting the question wrongly, but in the model that we are promoting, I'm talking the architectural model, the brokers we're on the side of discoverability. They have a role which is obviously essential, but based on metadata. This idea that we will be in a position to use these metadata before doing sharing. That's a central subject in Gaia X, in as much as this is part of the services, the federated services described in the architecture of Gaia X, and which are currently being defined. So this could be the main authority which would allow the discoverability, or to ensure discoverability of the data to be exchanged. On the other hand, this is not necessarily a component that we consider to be indispensable, in as much as we can imagine participants who already know each other. So I'm imagining an existing ecosystem with participants who know each other or not. Those who know each other, they don't need the broker in order to exchange data. As soon as you have a certain number of information about data we want to exchange, we don't necessarily require to do searches with brokers. I don't know if I've answered the question by the person asking it. Please don't hesitate to add more information to the question in the chat if I haven't answered appropriately. A question from Emmanuel Mondon. Emmanuel Mondon, who are you asking this question of? You're asking a question about the difference between data exchange. Yes, hello, for my question. This is for all the speakers. We're talking a lot about data sharing, but I think that some people are envisaging data exchange. And I think this is one-to-one. And so you don't need interoperability, and we're switching over to brokers. A broker can be an entity which establishes a link between a customer and a service provider without necessarily evoking interoperability. Whereas with data sharing, it's obligatory that we have data sharing, and very obligatory we have interoperability. Thank you. Yeah. This is a subject that we see assez regularly. You know, people often ask us this question, the difference between data exchange and data sharing. I think it's quite close to what's just been said. The essential difference we see, obviously, is the capacity in the one-to many, as you know, people who we don't already know. So the use of brokers in order to see what's available, and obviously then the exchange. So introducing this dimension of trust between participants, and also via use control to see how data will be used. And this allows us to, allows us to make the difference between things which are more sensitive. This is the crucial difference that we make between what already exists, and that's data exchange, and data sharing. Thank you. I see Jean-François Penciolelli. You've asked two questions on the chat, and perhaps it would be good for you to ask those questions. So hello, everyone. Sorry, I linked in a little late. Sorry if the subject has already been answered. There are a certain number of domains, like health, where interoperability has been promoted in order to allow for the emergence of industrial stakeholders and the digitalization or the computerization of hospitals and the offer of health services. So, so what about international norms in terms of interoperability? They're linked to use cases for, dealing with patients. and how is this sector different in terms of offerability for other activity sectors? Why aren't we seeing the interoperability emerge? This interoperability we were talking about in other sectors? Or why is it more difficult? Who wishes to answer that question? Sorry, I hadn't put on my video, so now you can see what I look like. I have an element. It's quite limited with regard, but it's because of the use cases we see on this subject, and which are not very numerous currently. Essentially, it's because data can't move. That means they're in the hospitals, and it's because they're personal data, they can't leave the hospitals. So it's extremely difficult to start imagining an exchange of elements when we have default security levels of security which are very strong. Yes. Yeah, data as it was the automobile market, and by necessity for the interaction between laboratories, imaging, invoicing, things like that. So the fact of having a multitude of stakeholders around this computerization has led to the establishment of standards that we know. And the same thing applied in clinical research with CDISC type formats. So we can't interoperability just for its own sake. We have to talk about it with regard to an objective to coordinate healthcare, for example. We can't automatically solve everything in the domain of health. But why would it be fundamentally different in the automobile industry? I think it's been done with regard to dealing with constructors, subcontractors, and everything to do with scheduling. But I'm trying to understand because this is calling to question the major platforms by saying, or is it just because there's no other use which is sufficiently strong to have these platforms of the data opened? I have my idea on this. There's several problems. Limited trust is an issue. There's an issue around proportionality. But there is something here that's quite significant. If you're looking at medical imaging, it's fairly easy to establish continuity. It's hard to unify these things, but images don't have any value if there's no context. If you don't have a whole environment of data, and this is where you have discontinuity. A medical report in the same hospital is not always written. If you change department or change unit, things aren't the same. There have been research papers produced which show that you have people to understand, people call each other to understand what is in a report. And this is a major subject. And I think this is what led to the end of the initiative, the Watts initiative in IBM in the health domain. At the end of the day, they had more people who were compliant with data than people who were involved in epidemiology and machine learning. And think this is different from the data industrial detail, which are very standardized because we're talking about supply chains. In the medical domain, the curriculums were not designed in order to allow standardization. In my last book, I've talked about the Shanghai system. We're talking about elements like temperature in images. You have problems to do with continuity.
Maybe to complement, I think that in terms of interoperability from a semantic point of view, it may exist with the standards that you talked about, DCOM, etc. But the technologies that are used to try and respect the confidentiality of data is of different order from what may be noted in other sectors because the standards are quite high. See it in a research program that we participate in. The issues of personal data are very difficult to manage, and also the contextualization of data, the relation between pictures and diagnosis. It requires huge work. Maybe it's a question of time also. It is noon. We're going to have to close this morning discussion. Just a quick intervention. Yeah, just to add to what was said, in the digital village of health, there's a big issue of interoperability. There's semantic with CGPS, with a database that is bigger, taking into account referencing of data, of health data. There's interoperability at issue with the national health identifier. So there's a whole program to have interoperability in France in the sector of health. And we shouldn't forget that it's the user that has got control to how the data. This is what I just wanted to add. Thanks, Jan. So we should maybe close this morning's session. We would like to thank you for your participation. We will meet again this afternoon for the second part of the event as from 1:30, and Anna will moderate that part of the day around the DAPSI project with 2 roundtables about user experience and adoption with Michiel, and second roundtable about the transfer of technologies, so subjects that have been touched upon this morning, and that will be studied in more detail this afternoon. We'd like to thank the interpreters. Without you, we couldn't have this kind of event. We'd like to thank also all of those who helped us from a technical point of view for this Zoom meeting. So we will resume at 1:30 with the same Zoom link. Thank you.